Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air.
Good evening. This is Dr. Dan, and this is Freedom Forum Live, streamed Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern on Facebook, YouTube X, and Rumble. Tonight, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting. A quote usually attributed to Mark Twain, probably originated in the American West and was popularized by Western politicians, ranchers, and water rights advocates. Although the true source is uncertain, the saying captures perfectly the essential truth that whiskey is a non-essential luxury consumed for pleasure, while water is an absolute necessity worth fighting for to obtain and protect it. Ranchers, farmers, miners, cities, and states fought bitter legal battles and political battles over water rights. In areas where natural water sources like rain is limited, simple control of a river, creek, spring, or irrigation ditch can mean success or failure for a farmer and even survival of an entire community. Wallace Stegner said, "In the West, when you touch water, you touch everything." Disputes over rivers and irrigation led to decades of lawsuits and political battles in California, Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado. The 1922 Colorado River Compact divided the basin into upper and lower regions among 7 states. Subsequent treaties and laws, collectively called the Law of the River, allocate water to United States, different states, and to Mexico. The Bureau of Reclamation manages key projects, including Lake Mead and Lake Powell. In recent years, natural changes in climate and rainfall have reduced water flow in the Colorado River, and reservoir levels have become critically low. The states and communities subject to the Law of the River are now engaged in critical negotiations and potential legal action to balance the needs of growing urban communities, farmers, ranchers, and the general health of the Western ecosystem. In the West, when you touch water, you touch everything. That is true. And tonight, my guest is Howard Hutchinson, a longtime friend and property rights activist who happens to know a lot about both property rights and water rights. So, Howard Hutchinson, welcome as a guest on Freedom Forum Live.
Well, I'm really happy to be here with you and looking forward to our conversation.
Well, Howard, anything as important as water has to have a long history of rights, written and unwritten. And as you are my guest, it is my guess that those rights go back to the English common law or even further back. What do you say, Howard?
Well, certainly in the eastern United States, people are familiar with what is called the riparian water law. And that basically did come from the English common law. And it says that if your property is touching a surface water source, you can use that water for whatever purpose you wish, which includes drilling a well and utilizing the groundwater in those particular areas. But water law goes back, is a very ancient concept, particularly amongst the arid lands in the Middle East. In the Bedouin tribes, when one was traveling through a community, it was considered to be a grave insult to not stop and take or partake of water that was left on jugs in front of the tents. So that is, it sounds like a custom or of the culture, but it is the concept that travelers are allowed to utilize water. And that's where basically our Western prior appropriation came from. First in time, first in right. And one of the earliest codifications, the written law, was the Justinian Code. And Western states have adopted variations, with the southwestern states adopting Spanish and Mexican water law principles.
Well, Howard, you mentioned the Middle East, and we already know, if we've watched movies and read books about old times in the Middle East, that there was an oasis, and because that was where the water was, sort of civilization or people would gather and settle around the oasis. But you're right, when caravans came, they would stop at the oasis, and of course, they were invited in, and there was certain customs that involved people around water, guests, and those who theoretically owned those water rights. Isn't that true?
And that's basic. That's the basic principle in the West when they were moving large herds of cattle, and they would be coming across somebody's settled land. And in later on, those became livestock allotments. But there was a written law that says that those traveling cattle, those herds that were being moved across the land, had to be allowed to partake of any surface waters that may be available, but they had to drink and move on. They weren't allowed to stay and graze. So it's,
Well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say that really is about the same thing as a caravan in the Middle East. I mean, you come and you pay your respects. No one no one who lives in the oasis is going to forbid you from coming in, because that could mean death traveling across the desert. And same with the cattle. So these are laws. These are kind of what I would say laws of neighborly necessity, wouldn't you say? That you had to be you had to understand certain necessities. I wouldn't say they were rights as much as they were kind of the recognition that there are necessities when water is in short supply, wouldn't you?
Yes, and there are spiritual connections to water. Water being, of all of the elements, it is the only thing that reacts to sound frequencies, and it will form shapes based on the frequencies that are being bombarded on it. So um, part of the Eastern religions is the recognition that it is sound frequency and the content of water in our body that makes up life, and it's universal. So when we talk about water and the right to water and the necessity of water, we don't live without it. Nothing, no organic shape that we can see on this planet does not function without water. That's just the way it is, and the water and the frequency that bombards it shapes every organic feature that we can see, including our own bodies. So it's when you start talking about those natural rights, the ability to bring your caravan into an oasis, or your traveling livestock herd into a water source in the West, it is part of that understanding of that natural law that you have to have water in order to survive.
That's pretty interesting. And how about the Indians? I assume that the Indians also had certain rights that they observed among the tribes.
In the West, water is considered to be sacred amongst the tribal governments, but uh, uh, it isn't any more sacred for the indigenous as it was for the Westerners that arrived on the continent. Um, it is Water is sacred. It is the element. It is the life force. So um, I don't know that I'm advocating that we adopt the indigenous concept of sacredness of the water, but if we don't, and we don't recognize its importance, we die. It's just that simple.
Well, I mean, we all know the importance of water for life. Our bodies are made up of a huge percentage of water, and water is necessary for all living things. But of course, there was a time when the federal government became involved, of course, and that probably made things. I don't know. What adjective should we use when the federal government gets involved in something?
Complicated?
That would be a good place to start, wouldn't you think?
I would say that we lived very well in this country under the riparian rights because they were both the French and the English settlers uh, very well understood those common law rights. Uh, and the government really wasn't involved in adjudicating water disputes because it was abundant in the eastern states. It's not abundant in the western states, but by the time we were settling out here under the English common law, it just didn't work. But the Spanish and the Mexicans and the indigenous cultures had already adopted the doctrine of prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. So the Pueblos that were here and that have been here for several thousand years, they had irrigation systems set up. They had what the Spanish termed acequias for their irrigation systems. There was in the Spanish law and in the Mexican law, there is a mayordomo who is in charge of the ditch, and what the mayordomo says goes. When he tells you you have an hour of water that you can divert, you divert for an hour and no more. Under the tribal systems, they were more communal and they were always operating together on doing the irrigation, planting, and harvesting. So they didn't really need a mayordomo over their system, although the chief or the head person on the tribe or the pueblo was the one that would make sure that the water flowed and the plants grew. So Spanish water law evolved directly out of the Justinian Code. And they had what was called the Siete Partidas. And the Siete Partidas dictated who had control over the water. And of course, in Spanish law, it was the king. And the king had jurisdiction over all surface waters, all coastal waters, all inland waters, and everything except for stock waters. If you came and got a land grant from the king and you stocked your land grant with livestock, you had total control over the surface water that was available for your livestock within that land grant. And then there was also the community grants, and they would have acequias and irrigation delivery and domestic water supply. Neither one of those was under the jurisdiction of the king. It was the only exception. Everything else the king held power over, and he distributed the rights to the water. So it's a very interesting thing. Mexican water law continued with that same concept. And most of the southwestern states, the arid states, adopted essentially the principles of the Spanish and Mexican water law.
Well, a thought just occurred to me. You're talking about surface waters. What about wells? Were they considered part of the surface water system?
Let's say you had a community, and the community dug a well. Basically, that was outside of the jurisdiction of the king. But as we became a territory here in New Mexico and Arizona, New Mexico started regulating groundwater because there was a recognition that there was a connection, often called a red line connection, between the groundwater and the surface water. And so well drilling requires a permit now. Delivering water from a well requires it to be metered. And you have to have a water right attached to that well. So I have 2 wells. I have what's called an acre of water rights with the one well, and I have a half-acre water right with the other well. I can deliver water out of that well, basically 3.33 acre feet of water, because it's recognized that some of the water that I apply to irrigation returns back to groundwater. So it's called a duty. It's a water duty, and some places it's 1.77 acre feet per acre, and some places like here, it's 3.33 acre feet per acre. So it can get really complicated. And if I were to attempt to drill a well, I would have to advertise it. I would have to state in that advertisement what my diversion right was that I was claiming. I would also have to allow for a three publications and allow for parties who might object to my new well the opportunity to contest it. And they could appeal to the state engineer to contest it based on the potential of my impairing their groundwater source. Impairment, again, is another, it's another sticky wicket.
Well, that's pretty interesting because here in where we live, we just drill a well. You hire a drilling company, they drill a well. The well is not metered. If you have a really good well with a lot of flow into it, then you're in really good shape. If it's not so good, then you dig a little bit deeper, so you have kind of a catch basin in the bottom of the well, and you put your pump down in it. But one way or the other, here we don't have to account for the water that we take out of our wells.
We just concluded a Supreme Court case where Texas challenged New Mexico on the lower Rio Grande. And there is a required amount of water that has to flow out of the Rio Grande River and be delivered to Texas. Well, Texas is kind of doubled up on their water. For wells, whatever water is down below your property is yours. You drill a well, that's your water. In New Mexico, under our Constitution, the water belongs to the state. All the water belongs to the state.
Wow.
And so you have to have permission to drill, but in Texas, they don't. So the case that we're talking about here on the Rio Grande, irrigators right close to the Texas line between Texas and New Mexico drilled wells and started irrigating. Well, Texas said, hey, you're actually diverting surface water. That bright line that I was talking about before, the connection to the groundwater to the surface water. And the withdrawal of the water from those wells was diminishing the surface water delivery to Texas. And the Supreme Court just authorized the settlement of that case in favor of Texas. So New Mexico is going to have to shut down all of those irrigation wells and only utilize the surface flows that are allowable under our compact with Texas. It's the Colorado, New Mexico, Texas compact. And so anyway, that case has been in court. I think it's right at about 25 years now. So, and one of the other sayings associated with water is water flows uphill to money. And the Texas legislature set aside $1 billion to sue the state of New Mexico, and the New Mexico legislature set aside $100 million to defend itself. So we see who won that case.
Well, but that's kind of interesting. Doesn't this all relate to upstream, way upstream, the Colorado River and the dams and all that kind of stuff? Isn't that all part of that big, massive compact where everyone's fighting now over who gets what, how many drops of water?
Well, there are literally billions of gallons of water in the form of snowfall and other precipitation that falls on the watersheds of the state of New Mexico. When you have closed canopies in your high elevation forest, the snow settles on the tree boughs and it does what is called sublimation. It goes from snow to water vapor without becoming liquid. It never reaches the ground. And what little bit does reach the ground, it reaches duff that can be as much as 2 feet thick from the needle fall and tree branches, etc., that blanket the forest floor when you don't have proper forest management. We estimate that we are losing about 10 to 15 and as much as 17% of our surface water flow and the equivalent in groundwater recharge from the condition of our forest, mostly managed by the federal government. So here we go back to the complications when the government manages resources.
That's a very interesting concept, because obviously when you go into Montana and up in that area, there's a lot of snowfall. And you would think that that would help to a great degree to fill the coffers of the Colorado River and things like that. But apparently there is a certain amount of wastage even up there, I would imagine.
Uh-huh. Well, one of our very learned friends in the property rights movement wrote an article on that very thing. You can't fill the bathtub when you have the plug removed. The management by the Bureau of Reclamation and the National Park Service over the Colorado River, along with the Endangered Species Act, has resulted in huge releases of water out of Lake Mead and Lake Powell to satisfy, number one, the endangered Colorado River chub. The recreational aspect of the Grand Canyon, when you don't have these big natural spring runoff flows, your beaches start eroding. And so the campsites for people who float the river become diminished. So they came up with the bright idea that they were going to start, quote, mimicking the spring flows out of those two reservoirs. Also, they set up an agreement with Mexico that they were going to release enough water out of Lake Mead and Havasu, Lake Havasu, so that water on the Colorado River would actually flow and actually reach the Sea of Cortez. So combine all of those things together with the diminished water delivery from the watersheds, and you get the perfect storm. Less water, and water just being allowed to be released and run down the river. Now, when Lake Powell was formed with the Glen Canyon Dam, there was a big environmental uproar about the construction of that dam. And they've been pushing ever since to have that dam decommissioned and removed. My theory, when I put on my tinfoil hat, is that the Bureau of Reclamation got populated with people who are aligned with that idea of decommissioning Glen Canyon Dam. And by releasing all the water out of it and losing its hydroelectric capacity, it all of a sudden, well, gee, what do we need the dam for if it can't produce enough electricity? So anyway, it is a calamity of errors, and I feel very deliberate error, not errors, but deliberate actions that have resulted in less water in Lake Mead. I floated down the Colorado River, the upper part from the Green River into the Colorado and into Lake Powell many years ago. And it was one of the highest flows that had ever been recorded on the upper Colorado River. When we took out on Lake Powell and we were journeying back and getting up close to the dam, we looked over and go, wow, what's that? They actually had to build steel plates like 10 feet high on top of the dam to keep the water from going over the top of the dam. It was totally full, and it was over full. They opened up the emergency floodgates. There was so much water pressure that it blew out the concrete channel for the emergency floodgate, and they had to do an emergency shutdown of the floodgates because it blew through the concrete and it was eating the sandstone cliff away at about a foot every 10 minutes. And would have taken out the whole canyon. But anyway, we went from that level in Lake Powell to what we have now, which is minimal. And it's just been poor management.
Isn't Los Angeles involved in this in some way? Don't they get their water out of here?
Los Angeles has some very big pipelines that go from the Colorado River over into Los Angeles. They also have very big pipelines that deliver water to San Diego and a little bit farther south. And here is California sitting on the largest body of water in the entire world called the Pacific Ocean. They actually shut down a desalination plant. They've recently attempted to reopen it at a low level, but since they were getting such cheap water from the Colorado River, they didn't want to build desalination like Saudi Arabia and Israel have done, and basically turn deserts into oases. So again, we just have total illogical, no common sense government actions that keep a stranglehold on water. My wife was mentioning a film that came out about a while back, The Big Short.
The Big Short.
The Big Short. And it was all about how these guys capitalized on the government's lending and bundling of mortgages, and they made young guys who figured out the scam and just made millions and millions of dollars on it. At the end of the movie, the main character is kind of walking off, and a person asks him, well, what are you going to do next? He goes, water. So it's happening.
Well, there's no shortage of people who are very willing to take advantage of every situation they possibly can in order to become more wealthy. I mean, that's part of the free market, and I am a free market person. The problem is when it works to the detriment of millions of people like it is now. And I think the government also has their hand in this, as you know, because they are the ones who allow a lot of this to go on through inaction or deliberate inaction, wouldn't you say?
It's it's fraud, pure and simple fraud and grifting. The grifter gets his slice from the government and then kicks back a portion of that to the campaign coffers of the politician that secured the gift for the grifter. So it's and we're watching now, just the tip of the iceberg that's been being uncovered in the fraud in Medicare, Medicaid, education, home care, hospice. But you take the entire expenditure of the government, and when you're talking about trillions of dollars, if the grifter can only tap into 1%, they make lots of money. Now, you said you're a free market. I'm absolutely free market, but this is not free market. This is what Bernie Sanders screams and yells about, the oligarchy, but the oligarchy is he.
True, with 5 houses or however many he has. Well, this is all what the problem with government is in general, is that it has become so large because people pay them to be large. The people who are elected to office want to continue in office, and in order to continue, it takes money, and so they vote to secure the incomes of people who support them. And that has been going on probably for millennia to some
Yes.
degree. And it causes the failure of governments and societies, as we have seen if we know history. Rome fell for that reason, and so did Greece. And our country is really on the brink of having the same thing happen. We cannot continue to spend huge amounts of money more than we take in. It's just not possible.
I guess I can paraphrase that the brave men secure liberty and prosperity. Prosperity weakens the population, and then the population is lost. So it runs in circles. We've been running around in this circle for, well, all the time human beings, I guess, have been on the planet. We do actually have a system set up under our Constitution that was supposed to do away with that. We have forgotten it. The brave men that fought and died and created it have created such a fabulous country that we've just become overweight and slovenly and forgotten. And in forgetting, we lose. When we look at what the government did, the Reclamation Act was passed in 1902. The Clean Water Act was in the 70s. The Drinking Water Act was in the 70s. The Environmental Protection Act was in the 70s. The Endangered Species Act was in the 70s. And when you look at us from the middle of or let's say the end of the 1970s, 1980, the slow, steady progression or degression of the country is readily visible. It looks like we made a mistake. We could have maintained a system of justice where if your rights were harmed, you had a possibility of redress. If you have a court system that administers justice. Okay, so every one of those acts that I just cited go directly at regulating water. With those acts, the federal government is like at 99.9% in control of water now. And if we don't watch out, and this caution is for the eastern states, we're watching very closely what's going on with the Okefenokee and the declaration of a World Heritage Site over some of the largest amount of fresh water in the Southeast. And if you don't think it's about control of water, you better wake up because it's happening.
Well, that's the waters of the U.S. rule, which fortunately some of that was taken away by the Supreme Court recently. But nevertheless, you're absolutely right. Control is what government is all about. Their goal is to control our lives. The more freedom we have, the less they can do. The more control they have, the less freedom we have. And that's what's happened. Everything that the government has done in the last 100 years, pretty much, has been aimed at taking away our ability to control them. I always like to laugh at a quote by Mark Twain when he said, "If voting mattered, they wouldn't let us do it." And that's really true, because we've reached a point in this country where voting does not matter, because you don't have a choice anymore. When a candidate for Senate spends $200 million to get elected to a job that pays $175,000 a year, you know exactly what's going on. And that is, as you said, it's fraud. And it's the ability to continue to remain in power by favoring people with money. I think one of the worst things that happened is when corporations were allowed to contribute to campaigns. I don't think corporations are people. I think people should be allowed to support candidates, but corporations with huge amounts of money, with a huge bankroll, a huge checking account and bank balance, can affect who gets elected. And all you have to see now how much money is spent in campaigns, and you see what's going on. Our government is the best government that can be bought, and that's exactly what they are.
I kind of look at it from the standpoint, and I believe most of our founding fathers would say that we could have this form of government that they envisioned with an educated and moral public. As we have become less educated and immoral, we have declined. And I say this. I say this with a little bit of wonderment, but I had a very good friend that was just an unbelievable con man. He could con the shirt off of a homeless person. Anyway, he emphasized to me that there was no possible way he could con an honest person. He'd never been able to do it. But he was a very successful con man. So there's a lot of people who just are not honest. They're not honest with themselves, and they're not honest with their community. So we elect them to office. And, give them, but throughout history, you deprive a people long enough, and the strong amongst those people will rise up, and they will bring it back to educated and moral people. It always happened. It's always happened. It's too bad that we have to go through those cycles.
Well, but what you're seeing is the result of decades of a decay in the education system here, which is now purposely dumbing down people. They're not teaching American history. They're not teaching math. They're not teaching science. They're not teaching the core curriculum that people need to be truly educated. They're not teaching the history that kids need to know in order to compare what is going on now to the failures of the past. For instance, if you know what happened to Roman civilization hundreds of years ago, you'll see that we're doing the same thing now as they did. Over and over again, that cycle. When people are immoral and uneducated, as you pointed out, that's when the country decays. But I think you're right that there is a core of educated and moral people who are young enough to perhaps rise in a group and may have an effect on preventing the demise of America. I don't know.
Well, I don't know how many people Stalin had or Lenin had, but it was a very small number, very small percentage of the population that allowed Marxism to just swallow an entire country. Again, the con can only be successful with uneducated and immoral people. when I come to somebody and I say, oh, I've got this free doodad here and you can't live without it, and I will give it to you. People just don't seem to be able to resist.
Well, it's true because 3% of the population fought the revolution, and they were successful. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I hear reports of it in other countries like Ireland, for instance, where there's now people standing up and saying, we're not going to let this country go. We are not happy with the course the country is on, and it's going to change. And that's what's going to have to happen here. Enough people are going to have to stand up and say, this is enough. We're not going to let America disappear.
But going back to water, if we don't watch very carefully, they will control the water. Control of water controls your food production.
Your life. It controls your life.
It controls your life. Another very good friend of mine who was a psychologist, but he had a great deal of common sense. And he said, Howard, we measure standard of living by the wrong criteria. The government says, and other people, most people think that it's the amount of money that you make in an annual income gives you a high standard of living. But he said there's air. You can't live without it. You might be able to survive 2 or 3 minutes without breathing. Water. You may, depending on where you're at, you may be able to go 20 days without water.
Probably not.
Probably not. At the end of about 10 days, you're going to be pretty crazy. Food, most of the obese America could probably go 40, 50, 60 days without eating. Shelter from the elements. And he said, okay, that is the measurement of standard of living. If you have those things, when you say shelter, you've got some kind of lean-to or some kind of home or clothing. If you have those 4 things, you have a high standard of living. And the better, the quality of each one of those things. So if you have good air quality, you have good water quality, you have good food quality, and you have good shelter quality, you're living really good. So air, water,
food and shelter.
Food and shelter. And water is connected to all of the other 3. Air quality is based on the amount of water producing the vegetation that converts our carbon dioxide into usable oxygen for us. It provides a certain amount of stability in our climate and our weather. All 4 of the things are connected together, but water is the key element and it has been recognized as the key element throughout all of mankind's history. So when Noah started building the ark and saying, there's a whole bunch of water coming, we better listen.
Well, that's true. Howard, I think you've sort of nailed it. I think there is a whole bunch of water coming, one way or the other, and we all better be ready for it. That's
Yes.
what I think. And I want to thank you very much for spending some time talking with me tonight, because we've talked on things that are very important. And I hope people understand that this has been a pretty philosophical, in many ways, discussion, because there are practical sides of water, but there's also the philosophical side of water, and you've been able to discuss that. So, you have a final word or two you'd like to say?
Well, I had my irrigation on when we started this conversation, and my alarm went off for me to shut that irrigation off. So my meter is spinning, and I'm now an hour over, but the field and the trees are loving it, getting an extra hour of water. So I will just sign off with that. It's just hoping that we will get some rain. I will not have to irrigate so much.
Howard Hutchinson, it is always a pleasure to talk with you. You've made my evening tonight.
Well,
Have a-
you always make my evening. So
All right. Good night, y'all. And thanks for being a guest on Freedom Forum Live.
thank you.